Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'll firstly pay tribute to all those members who've given their maiden speeches today. They were very impressive indeed, and I wish them all well in their futures as representatives of their constituencies, and hope they all do well by their communities. I suppose a particular mention must be made, though, Madam Deputy Speaker, of the Honourable Member for East Lothian's contribution, whose reminders of Scotland's past certainly stirred passion in the hearts of those on these benches, and I'm sure if you'd been in the chamber yourself, Madam Deputy Speaker, would have stirred passion in your own as a fellow Scot. However, moving to the subject of this debate, I was delighted to hear in the programme for government that the UK government will finally be taking steps to address greenhouse gas emissions. I was equally disappointed, but not even slightly surprised, sadly, to find that the target date for doing so is 30 years in the future. Not so much too little too late as turning up with a fire safety manual long after the building has burned to the ground. Now, we had a statement in here just last week about the devastation caused by the worst Australian bushfire season ever. I pointed out then, and I'll point out again now, that it hasn't just been Australia on fire. We've seen the Arctic burning too. Huge swathes of Siberian forest, fires in Greenland, Alaska and Canada. We know that the Amazon has fires that are beginning to threaten the ecosystems of the rainforests. We know that this is an emergency. We know that the planet will change as a result of human activity, and the only question is how much. We know that biodiversity is being threatened and that the crops we rely on are under threat. We know all that, but the UK government thinks that deferral and procrastination are okay, that nothing much will change between now and 3 decades hence. So let's have some sense of 30 years, some perspective on what that is. 30 years ago was the first report of the IPCC calling for urgent action, strong measures to prevent serious global warming. That was 30 years ago. And there are some members of this Parliament who hadn't even been born yet. We have wasted their lifetime so far without real action. Something else that's interesting about this place of 30 years ago is that the then Prime Minister was calling for action on this issue and calling for some fast action to get emissions under control. Now, Margaret Thatcher might have been horrified were she to have realised that her own party would still be footering about on the edges of the issue 3 decades later. This is not just some sort of policy issue that can be revised at some future point. It is not just a passing fad that can safely be ignored. This is disaster politics coming at us with a vengeance that we cannot easily comprehend. Failing to act now doesn't leave the options open to act later, it closes them down. A failure to act a heck of a lot more speedily than 3 decades on will simply condemn future generations to ongoing and escalating effects that they will have to spend more and more time contending with. And it will also condemn us, this generation, that has had it so easy by comparison, to living a far less comfortable retirement, because much of our time and much of the effort of future governments will be devoted to addressing the ill effects of government failure now. The UK government claims to want to lead the way in addressing climate change, but it doesn't actually seem to be doing much to, address climate change. So let's take a donder with the IPCC. The latest report tells us that 3/4 of transport emissions are from road transport. So if the government was serious about addressing climate change, there would be massive investment in electric vehicle technology, charging points and other infrastructure, to be sure, but also research into better, less expensive technologies. Where is the commitment to do this? Where is the commitment to build more capacity for rail freight and take some of the wagons off the road? And the biggest emissions culprit is heating and power. Will there be a 0 rating of VAT on renewable energy, all of it, from construction to use? The government will say that it has no power to do that until it's free of the EU. So when can we expect to see that Brexit benefit? And while we're at it, what about exempting building works and refurbishments which improve insulation? What about investing in better houses to begin with? What about offering incentives for insulation solutions like aerogel for passive houses and for district heating schemes? You know, there's no actual evidence that this government intends to do anything to actually lead on climate change, and there is a similar lack of evidence that the government has any idea about what to do about air quality. The 25-year plan had an ambition, if that's the right word to use, to reduce 5 air pollutants by half in 11 years. Only 5 of the pollutants getting pumped into children's lungs, and only reducing them by half maybe eventually. It's like having an ambition to paint every 3rd plank of your garden shed, but only halfway up and only at some point in the future. In the meantime, the garden shed is rotting away and will collapse long before that painting is finished. Now, way back in September of 2016, I asked the then Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs whether she planned to maintain air pollution targets set out in the Ambient Air Quality Directive following the UK's withdrawal from the EU. In response, I got, as often happens, a lot of words and no real answer. That response claimed that the Clean Air Act of 1956 was an example of the UK acting on improving the environment, rather than responding to thousands of Londoners being killed by smog in 1952. It touted this as evidence of long-standing UK commitment to environmental action. It also said air quality has improved significantly in recent decades. We are working at local, national and international levels and will continue to do more, but it never answered that question about a commitment to match the EU's air pollution targets. So this government, in my view, and in many others' views, waffles a lot and delivers little, if anything. The time for action was quite some time ago. The response was and is still lacking. We have gone from a need to take action 30 years ago to a promise that action will be taken in 30 years hence. No answers to the questions being asked, no idea what they mean.
Yeah.
I think she's making a really powerful point about air pollution, and she highlights real concerns, and does she agree with me that these concerns are further backed up by this government's action, where they've lost at least twice in the High Court to Client Earth because they're not taking proper action on air pollution? We've got 40,000 premature deaths a year due to air pollution. The fact they won't even commit to matching EU standards is a real concern that she's highlighted.
Absolutely, and my honourable friend makes fantastic points, and I can only agree with him on this, because that's clear evidence of this government's continued failure to act, and I appreciate his contribution. Thanks.
Thank you. Andy MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Madam